Okay, I think a few people have joined us. Good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Galloway, the director of IBT. This is perfect weather for listening to a podcast. So when we finish and we're all inspired, we can go off and sit in the park with our headphones on and listen to Today in Focus. We're delighted to have Rachel Humphreys with us. Hi, Rachel.
Hello.
From her famous bedroom, which she hasn't left for 18 months.
No, I haven't.
So let me start off, just for those of you who maybe are not regular listeners to Today in Focus, to just give you a quick summary of what it is. So it comes from The Guardian. It's a daily Monday to Friday current affairs podcast that runs for about 30 minutes. It's different from the normal run-of-the-mill news or current affairs podcast. It doesn't stick slavishly to the news agenda. It covers one story as I would say, a sort of documentary style approach. It's award-winning. It was named Best Current Affairs Podcast in the British Podcast Awards last year. Congratulations. It's an interesting mix of offbeat stories that are in the news, and quite a lot of international stories. In the last couple of months, there have been reports from Brazil, Syria, Gaza, Israel, Hong Kong, Egypt, Japan, Canada, China, and the US. Been reports on climate change, on the Olympics, not much on COVID, which is kind of a relief for me. So, good morning, Rachel. Shall we start at the beginning? How did Today in Focus start? What was the thinking, and what was your involvement at the beginning?
So, and I'll share my screen in a minute because I've got something to play about that. So The Guardian brought a team together in the summer of 2018 and obviously had seen some success at other newspapers in terms of launching dailies. And, you know, The Guardian had been quite at the forefront of podcasting, and there's a famous story within The Guardian that it was a Guardian journalist who coined the term podcast years ago. So we always hold on to that. But we'd done a daily podcast many years ago. We have the Football Weekly podcast, which is huge. So it seemed like the logical next step. And the idea was to give people a sort of experience behind the headlines, to understand how we report stories, and to kind of develop our journalists as well as characters, as people that the audience could relate to, and also to bring a new audience on board. We all know with podcasting that you're able to tap into groups of people that perhaps might not access your content ordinarily. And also it was part of a general movement at the time. There are many more daily podcasts now. The Times has one, The Economist, etc. It's a way, I think, to kind of escape from the sort of relentless 24-hour news cycle, as much as to break out of it, and often to turn attention to a story which might not be in the top 5 of the day, but it's still one that you want to pay attention to. And one thing I've definitely found, my background is in daily news. I used to work at Radio 4, at LBC, Channel 4 News. So it's very used to the sort of churn of daily minute changing headlines. And the lovely thing about this job is you realize that everyone has so much capacity for hearing stories, sometimes weeks after they've happened. And I can talk about this a bit later, but it's certainly something we've learned, that there is a benefit often from waiting for a while after an event before you try to tell the story of it, because things need to play out. We came together, and I'll just share my screen because I've got a bit of a presentation which has this was basically how we started. We originally looked like this with our logo when we launched in 2018, and we've recently gone through quite a big rebrand. And the lead presenter at the time was Anushka Asthana, who had come from working in broadcasting. She had a lot of broadcasting experience, but she'd never presented a podcast before. And definitely, I think she and I would say, I started presenting 2 years ago. We've really grown into it, and the podcast has changed a lot since then. So this is our new logo on the right, which we sort of jokingly say looks like the nighttime version of Today in Focus, like Today in Focus after hours. But I'm going to play a quick clip just so you can hear, and if you've never heard the podcast before, this will help, I think, of the first ever the first ever intro, basically, of our first ever episode when we launched at the beginning of November 2018, which was an interview with our correspondent in Brazil, Tom Phillips, who we might talk a bit about later. And it was about a man at the time who many people might not really have heard of, called Jair Bolsonaro. And that was our first ever episode. So I'll play that so you can hear it.
Just months after being written off, Jair Bolsonaro swept to power on Sunday. A man who's praised dictatorships and defended torture is about to become the next president of Brazil. The fourth biggest democracy in the world has been conquered by the far right. From The Guardian, I'm Anushka Astana. Today in Focus, who is Jair Bolsonaro and how did he persuade more than 57 million people to vote for him?
So it's quite different now, but that was how we launched. And you can hear there as well that one of the most important things for us, and obviously for podcasting in general, is sound design. And we have an amazing sound designer who also has an incredible name, Axel Kakutier. And Axel actually used to work with me at LBC, but he is a musician and he composed our theme and has just really built up like an incredible skill set over the last few years of developing sound. So we basically found this kind of harmony, I suppose, in bringing together like the amazing journalism that The Guardian does. We're really, really lucky to have so many great journalists. And combined with a team of audio producers, we work very hard to structure them. And then with the sound design, I think we hopefully managed to land on something which was kind of different and offered people something else. So yeah, that's basically how we started.
So you've said a couple of times that it's changed quite a bit. And I think one of the interesting things about podcasts is that they do evolve, they don't stand still. How would you characterize the ways in which it's changed?
So, I mean, the most obvious is for me to just tell you what we've done today, for example. And we now are, as of this week, this past 2 weeks, we look like a very different podcast. Anushka has now left. And we have 2 new hosts. So our international correspondent, Michael Safi, who is based in Beirut, and Nasheen Iqbal, who's a brilliant writer for The Observer. And between the 3 of us, we're going to share those presenting duties, and it will bring something quite different. And I think that's in terms of what you'll hear. I think the range of stories will change. I think we'll have a bit more of an international focus. I think one thing we've discovered as we've grown is that our audience, the heart of it is the UK, but actually I think we have more people listening overseas now than UK listeners possibly. We have a lot of people listening in different countries. So we have quite a large international audience. And one of the things we've started doing, which is new, which we didn't have full capacity for before, is a series. So our first big series was back in January. We did a series called 4 to 5, which was a series which explored a fascinating case. And it was like 5-6 episodes. You can listen to them all here.
I do recommend people listen to this if you haven't already.
Yeah, it's a miscarriage of justice story, or is it, basically, Mark? Maybe how you describe it.
Yeah, it's a fantastic yarn. Yes, I mean, it's odd to think it was. I mean, there were like five 1-hour episodes. It was a lot of listening, and it was never dull.
Yeah.
So shall we just try and dissect, in terms of the masterclass, some of the key elements as to why this works? So you've talked about tone of voice. What is it about the tone of voice that you aim for, and what have you learned about what works in terms of a tone of voice?
So, I mean, again,
okay, you've got a list, right?
Kind of a list that I think I've sort of made randomly in the past.
All right.
No, but you're quite right. The tone of voice. So yeah, there's the 2 things. There's the stories that we select and the rhythm of the week. 5 episodes a week is never enough. And if I could change anything, it would be that we could tell more stories. Like, we're constantly a bit hamstrung by only being able to tell 5 a week, because you have to have a balance in that week. You can't have 5 incredibly depressing stories. That's just a bit much for people. You have to kind of mix it up. And that doesn't mean you have to do light and dark. It means, you know, you might do British politics on a Tuesday, and then you might do, you know, something a lot more kind of difficult and emotional the next day. So we have to find a balance. And then the other thing is, in the tone of voice and the presentation style. And that's something I think that when Anushka was selected as the presenter, she inherently brought with her. I mean, she's just someone who's very, very good at explaining things it's cliche to say it, but, you know, like your friend down the pub. And that is kind of the tone that we've always taken, which is sort of simplifying things a bit, but not in a way that's patronizing. And I still think it's a really difficult line to tread, and it's one that we check ourselves on all the time when we're making episodes. So the question I will constantly be asking my producers is, am I assuming too much knowledge in that question? So when I'm writing my questions, or if I do a rewrite on a question because I made a mistake, you have to think very carefully about, you know, who you are. You're kind of leading the listener through, but I think the listener does assume that we know a bit more than them maybe, but not too much, because otherwise why would you be doing the interview? So it's kind of straddling that line really of when it's got to sound, and it is like a conversation between colleagues, but also, you know, you've also got a bit of that authority as the presenter to lead somebody through that conversation.
So do you assume that the audience knows something or nothing, or how do you manage that? Because I think everyone struggles with that. Some people in the audience will know about the subject and others won't.
And yeah, I'll give you a good example of when we struggled with it, and I don't think we've always got it right. So we did an episode quite a few months ago about what was happening in Tigray. And I think with that one, we were sort of struggling to know how much history we needed to provide for people to understand the situation. And I think we probably gave too much. Like, we really went back quite a long way into Ethiopia's history. And I didn't think actually when we listened back, we needed to. And I think sometimes you can, even if you assume that the audience doesn't really know anything about a country, it doesn't mean you need to tell them everything. There is a way of explaining themes and contexts without saying, and then this happened, and then this happened. And, you know, that's not, sometimes and the Freshwater series that I've mentioned is a really good example of this, because that was a very, very detailed, legally complicated story that Anushka managed to simplify in script. And I think script is a really powerful thing. Like, we do a lot, we make our pieces are conversation pieces, but if there's a part that's confusing, or there's a part where you need to sort of, as a presenter, step out and say, I'm leading my audience through this, then you go to script and you deliver it as script. And I think that's fine. And that often is the easiest way to say jump through complicated or a lot of context, because ultimately you're just kind of giving the color and the sounds to the story that you're trying to tell. But I think international stories are the real challenge for that, sort of not really knowing sometimes how much people will know. And I sort of think that I've always thought this in my career, and I think it was helpful for me coming from a commercial radio background, where you kind of have a sense a little bit of how much people keep up with the news. And, you know, I have a lot of friends who don't work in news, and I find that really useful. And I sort of think you kind of take a guess that people will know maybe a bit less than you, because we keep up on the news a lot, but not that much. And also that people will tend to be interested in the things you're interested in. So if there's a point in the interview where the interviewee says something really unexpected, and I'm like, oh, wow, I will usually say to the producer, we should keep that in, because it's a little nugget of information. And I think you were saying this yesterday, Mark, you know, we are often telling people stories that they might know or be familiar with. It's always nice to feel you can give those people something a bit extra. And so if there's something that jumps out to you as being a bit different or interesting, then we'll try and keep that in. But it is a constant thing that we're working on. And as I said, I don't always think we get it right.
Should we just go through these bullets? So, I mean, you do tend to have a question, and you're very good at constructing a narrative. So you give the episode a sense of purpose. You know, I'm a documentary maker by background, and these have that very much a feel of a documentary. You go on a journey, and the question helps you set the path of that journey. I mean, how did you come to that, and how does it always work, or are there other ways of doing it?
Sometimes I'm like, guys, what is the question at the end of us making it? With a bit of a rush.
I've heard that, yes.
Yeah, the idea was always, I mean, I think it's the gift of the name, and I didn't come up with the name. And so that partly sort of shaped it. And it definitely really helps to sort of work out what you're answering at the beginning and what the focus is. Because again, when I was talking just a moment ago about putting too much context in, there's a temptation when you come to make a podcast about something you haven't done before, that you need to tell the whole story and put everything in. Like, we're just making one today about the sort of Donald Trump's influence in the Republican Party and how that's playing out at the moment. And we had a huge amount in there about what the Democrats are doing. And so I was like, well, I think we should kind of take quite a bit of that out, because that's actually not the focus. And it's in the name, Today in Focus. You know, we do try and have a focus on stuff.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we can be a bit too general. So yeah, having a question at the start really, really helps. And then what we do is we tend to break a story up into parts, kind of chapterize it. And that is for two reasons. A, obviously to kind of create more of a narrative story out of a news item. And secondly, it's also for pacing. So you have to think and we've been doing this so long now, we understand how the sound design works a lot more than we did. You'll notice if you listen to the podcast, there'll be little pauses where music will pop up. And you know, you've got to work out where you leave them in, like where are the junctions when you're like leaving the audience.
So how many chapters would you typically have?
Depends, really. I mean, a few, and it honestly depends on the, and then what happens often in the edit is that changes again, and you realize that often the interview goes a different way from what you expect. And you know, I'm very much kind of a believer in not trying to steer overproduce the interviewee. I'd much rather, probably to the annoyance of my producers, have a good conversation that flows quite naturally. And I think one of the challenges when you first start interviewing, and I don't know if many of you, like my Present podcast, you're saying now, when you're interviewing someone, like I used to at the beginning just be reading my questions, and I just always wouldn't maybe be listening. And that's happening. You hear this on live radio all the time. I hear it on the Today program all the time. You can hear someone not listening to the end of the answer and going to the next question on the sheet. And then still obviously is thinking very hard about, and it sounds so obvious because it's what we do in conversation all the time, but literally picking up from what they've just said and working out how can you react to that, but also weave it into where you want it to go. So
you believe in you don't prep the interviewees beforehand. You don't have a research conversation with them. You just don't.
No, we do. It depends. I mean, yesterday I did an interview with an author, and you never get research conversations with authors. So no, that's very much off the fly. But usually they're very prepped anyway, because they'll be on some sort of promotional round. And sometimes we do really prep, and this will depend if the journalist that we're working with might have sent us a lot of audio. And if they've done that, then we probably will have a conversation with them about what we'd like them to sort of talk into, you know, what we'd like them to describe, if the producer should have had time to listen to the audio that they've sent over before the interview. And it really depends on the person. It's something we've learned as we go, that sometimes some people work really well if you send them the questions in advance, and other people are just happy to sort of wing it, basically. And I think I would rather never send the questions. Like this has happened as well when I used to work in live radio. I remember I worked at Women's Hour once, and we had this amazing lawyer come in to do an interview, and we suddenly realized when we went live, she was reading everything. And you just don't sound read. So I think
I've done that with academics, and they literally sit and they typed out their answers and they read them. They just don't realize how dull that is.
And I actually think a lot of broadcast training is to blame in some cases, because they do suggest that. And actually the best thing you can sound is obviously just quite conversational. And that's hard. And it's hard to produce that in everyone. But when I talk about the presenter tone, you want your interviewee as well, if you can.
I would say actually in terms of Today in Focus, that's the main change. It feels more relaxed and more conversational from those early episodes. Like even hearing Anushka do the opening, she sounds slightly edgy, you know, she's just much more relaxed now. So clearly doing a lot helps you become a better presenter.
Yeah, you definitely get more comfortable with it. And I mean, one that I did recently where I was just totally being myself was we made this horrible episode about the mouse plague in Australia.
Oh, yeah.
And I was just so disgusted by what the mice have been doing in Australia. And I don't know if people are familiar with some of the dirtier details of that story, but so it's you have to sort of work out as a presenter how much of yourself you put into a piece. And
so in terms of people listening, you have podcasts. What are the skills that make for a good presenter? What should they look for?
I think, yes, I suppose someone, I mean, literally pragmatically, someone who's quite calm under pressure because, you know, and who doesn't mind having a bit of pressure put on them and who can genuinely sort of empathize, obviously, with people and be a good conversationalist. I mean, I've worked with tons of presenters across radio who are not this, and yet they are still presenters. But anyway, I think that's really good. Obviously, a good voice helps. But one thing I would say is, you know, Anushka and I developed it. If I listen back to my early episodes now, I think I sound awful. And so I would always say, like, no one gets it immediately. And it takes a bit of time. And yeah, someone who is just genuinely inquisitive. And I think, yeah, who can really empathize with people if you're doing a difficult interview. You've got to have lots of different emotional skill sets. You know, you've got to be able to empathize in difficult situations, but also know when to make a bit of a joke. Like humor is so key actually to what we do. Being able to surprise the person you're interviewing by sort of ribbing them a bit can sometimes allude to reflections and thoughts that you might not ordinarily. And the other thing I'd say that we always do is just ask the obvious question. You know, often if you listen to political reporting, especially, people will ask very long questions to make themselves sound really important. And I remember the famous one that Anushka asked years ago. We were down in Westminster during the Brexit chaos. I don't know what was happening or what vote it was. And Jacob Rees-Mogg was, I think, beginning a coup. And everyone, the press pack was crammed outside the Houses of Parliament. And he walked out and everyone's shouting at him. And Anushka just shouted, "How do you feel?" And he turned around and he went, "What do you mean, how do I feel? I don't feel anything." And it was such a good answer because that's what we all expect from somebody like Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Yeah.
But that's the
Can I just say, Rachel, there's a question from Nick. So, by the way, if you want to ask questions, we would encourage you either put them in chat, or if you go in reactions and you'll see raise hand as an option, raise your hand, then I can see you straight away. Do you want to ask your question, Nick, or shall I ask it for you?
I can ask it.
Okay.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Nick.
How are you?
Great. Thank you so much for coming along.
To you because I listen to the podcast every day.
But... thank you.
Pleasure. So yeah, I was just wondering whether that tone that you developed over from when it launched up until now, was that something that kind of developed based on any kind of insight from what's worked with other podcasts? Because I know, for example, Ira Glass on This American Life, he has this very, very like nonchalant tone that almost sounds like he's not even interested at times, which is quite weird. But I've noticed that tone is not quite as extreme, but it is very like, it doesn't feel presenty, I guess.
Yeah.
Trying to say. And was that a conscious decision or not to do that?
I think it was quite organic. I mean, I do think that, and this is not true across the board, I think it's really helped us having female presenters. And I think that's not because men are not good at it, but because actually that's still quite different in mainstream news, podcasting and presenting, to have, you know, the thing that you've got with podcasting is the advantage to be a bit more relaxed. And I think it is quite organic. But I think that when I started a year after the podcast had launched, I quite consciously probably kind of copied a bit what Anushka was doing and then found my own feet, and that is a tone which is distinctly not broadcasting. I mean, I was trained in newsreading when I did my postgrad, and I worked in commercial, and that is a very like different way of speaking, and you want to get away from that. And I think when I'm talking on the podcast, and Anushka does this too, I do just talk like I do normally, pretty much. I don't really, except I might say
but
something.
I think that's what makes it so different. You know, if you're choosing to listen to Today in Focus rather than the Today program, you know, it's just the Today program, everyone takes themselves so seriously. Like you say, there's a self-importance. It's like the interviewer is showing off.
Yeah.
And you and Anushka are very self-effacing. And I think that's a skill that we in the NGO world need to learn, that we're often busy trying to show our credentials.
I think it also suits the medium so much better, because I feel like people consume podcasts when they're often doing something else all the time.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's a lot less intrusive to have that sort of presentation style, other than, for example, something like BBC, I think it's called NewsHour, their podcast, which is just basically the news clips, and it's just takes your attention away too much.
That's interesting. I mean, I think a good example of it at the BBC is Newscast with Laura Koonsberg and Adam Fleming.
Yeah.
If you listen to Laura Koonsberg on the 10 o'clock news, she obviously does not sound how she does in Newscast. And I think what's great about that podcast is it gives them an opportunity to be a bit more human and relaxed. And I think when you're talking about bringing that out in people, like you say, Mark, when you're working with people in NGOs, it's finding different ways to do it. So a really good way, I think, of getting people to relax a bit on the mic, if you want to do it this way, is to do sort of round table conversations. And if you've got someone they can interview who's a good character, who's a bit more relaxed. So I remember an episode I did last year, which really helped me with that, was we occasionally get 3 of our culture writers together who are all very fun, and we talk about what's coming up, you know, and it relaxes me to have a group of people to bounce off. And that's a really classic skill of presenter development. And I think that helps to just make it a bit more conversational, which is what you want, rather than someone peppering you with information.
Yeah. So let's just move on in terms of what makes for a good podcast. I think one of your skills is choosing a good story. That's probably quite hard to talk about, how you choose stories.
I have also got a bullet point list for this, but I haven't talked about a bit of this. So it's a mix in the week. So we'll have this week, if you tune in this week, it's very different. We're doing 5 episodes on the Guardian's exclusive Pegasus project expose, which actually is proving to be a really interesting podcast. And today it's all like spies and espionage. It's great. And like secret cameras hidden in ties and that kind of thing. So this is a bit different, but ordinarily we will have a top line story probably. So at the moment that is often COVID. So I think we're going to probably be thinking, we haven't done a COVID one in so much for a while. And the wins for us on COVID are doing one interview with a science correspondent who will basically tell you all you need to know right now about where we are. Because I think at the moment, a lot of people have questions, right, about the efficacy of the vaccines. What tests should I be taking if I have symptoms? Should I go to a nightclub? So Brexit was always that for us. In the dreaded Brexit days, we would be doing a Brexit episode at least once a week. And British politics, again, is one. And those are episodes that you can't do often over a very long time. So we sort of call them one-day turnarounds, where you'll do the interview really early in the morning and then get it edited and try and get it handed to the sound designer by the afternoon. And then you'll be, everything we do has to be legaled. So lawyers listen to everything. And so then it's a sort of back and forth on those days of re-recording stuff, adding things in as it changes, and you can end yourself up in a situation where you're going till midnight on those episodes, if the story allows. I mean, I remember when the Nicola Sturgeon, Alex Salmond hearings were happening a few months ago, we released an episode about it, and the story all changed at about 10 o'clock at night, which is a really fun evening. But yes, we have those ones, and then we have our kind of big global stories, and I'll talk about those a little bit if you want, like in a bit, because we want to talk about foreign stories. And then yeah, human stories. So like one voice pieces are great for us. So I'm just trying to think of an example of
well, the missing
yes,
people.
that's a good one. And this is important. So we did an episode a couple of weeks ago about families sort of relaunching searches for missing family members during the pandemic. And this was an idea for a story that I think actually came from a press officer at the charity, was chatting to Anushka, and Anushka thought, oh, this is really interesting. And that for us is, we do get pitched from outside. And I know some of you actually have emailed me about stories in the past, and we're always interested to engage and look at taking stories or case studies from outside the organisation, and we always welcome that. And this was a good example of it. And it was a really interesting episode. And this kind of story, it was an interview with a woman who now lives in Australia, who was trying to find her brother. And it went out on a Monday. And Monday is kind of like a really good spot for us because we make that episode on Friday. So you want something that isn't going to move too much. You'll notice that we don't tend to do top line news stories on a Monday because we don't work over the weekends unless we need to. So that Monday is a good place to do something that's current affairs, but not probably top.
So you would have researched that in the normal way. You would have talked to a number of people and you chose her for particular reasons. I mean, yeah. It was actually incredibly moving, that episode.
It definitely was. And when you're looking for case studies, and character I've written there is really important. And we will sort of talk to a few people, and it's getting a sense of their story that they're going to tell, and B, what kind of storyteller are they going to be comfortable? And it's sort of a toss up really, but it is very, very important to get the right voice. And so I think I didn't work on that episode, but they would have worked with the charity on that. And often it's just amazing actually if we can speak to people who've never done an interview before. So we did an episode a few months ago about gay conversion therapy, and I spoke to a lovely woman who had gone through that when she was a teenager. And again, that was through an LGBTQ plus charity who helped us find her. And she'd never done an interview before, but was sort of ready to talk about it. And what you need to obviously do in that situation is just a lot of work to make sure that that person is comfortable and happy with everything. And often we give people the chance to listen to edits before they go out. Not that they can actively change stuff too much, but just to check they're comfortable with everything. And so, duty of care is obviously really important in these situations. So I think, one voice pieces for us, just one interview with someone who's been through an experience, are really, really powerful. And as I say, may not be like top line news, but still important. And then the hardest thing for us, like the challenge that we come up against all the time, is to find stories that are light and fun. And that is really, really difficult because a lot of light, fun stories do not sort of survive for 25 minutes. If you want to sort of picture stories, we take things that, kind of have several facets to them. 25 minutes is actually quite a long time. And the thing that we always say to our print journalists when we ask them to do an interview with them is, your piece might have been like 1,000 words, but you sort of need to imagine this one as 5,000, because if we're going to ask you about these protests in Northern Ireland, we're not just going to do an episode about that. We're going to want to talk about the context and who are the characters and where could this go, and the analysis. So it's always a bit more than what's just on the page. But a really good example of when we did do light and fun very well was last year when the pandemic first started. We asked lots of listeners if they'd like to go on a blind date. So we matched a lot of listeners on Zoom dates, and they let us record it, and we then edited up the recordings. And I think one of the couples is still together actually. But that was very fun, and it was like producer Hannah was really clever about that, and it intersected, something that was happening in the world that we were all going through, with us creating some really fun audio ourselves. And we sent everyone some cocktails and a couple of them got very drunk. And so it made for like a lovely kind of Friday episode. And we got so much good feedback, because you have to remember it's quite intense listening to a podcast. It's in someone's ears. It's quite personal. And so you need to give people a balance of kind of hard news and also just like lifestyle and stuff that leads into chat.
There's a little debate in the chat about the optimum running time. Oliver, do you want to
Good question.
ask your question?
Yeah, because obviously podcasts can be as long as you want. You're not restricted to a time slot or anything like that. And also, I guess it also leads into the question: do you ever end up putting multiple stories in one episode? Because even though they might not have come together, actually they might link together or whatever. So I was just intrigued by that.
Yeah. So how long should a podcast be? Is obviously whatever, basically. Although I listen to some podcasts sometimes and I think they're too long. A lot of like sort of comedy chat podcasts I think could be a bit shorter. But everyone likes different things. And when you're putting a podcast on in the background to do the cooking or the cleaning, if it goes on for 50 minutes, you sometimes don't notice if it's interesting. We used to, when we first launched, we had an extra bit of the podcast. So we would do like a sort of 22-minute story, then we'd have a break, and then we had a comment piece. So we'd have a journalist or someone with an opinion sharing an opinion or an insight on something, kind of like a thought for the day. And we disbanded that pragmatically because when we went into lockdown, we didn't know how we were going to do the podcast and we had to suddenly all work from home. And then when we realized that actually the listenership liked us just doing one story for 25 minutes, that was actually fine. And so when we're making them, we do try to keep them under 30. But if you've got a really powerful story, I don't think there's any point in trying to make it short for the sake of it. And the rule I kind of follow is when we're listening through to an edit is, are we repeating ourselves in an edit? Have we made that point already? Do we need to make that point again? Is it all flowing? Yeah. So rather than saying
that's quite that's something documentary makers get wrong, that they think having two people saying the same thing reinforces the point, and it doesn't actually. It's less impactful than having one person saying it. It's quite a good skill to try and remove the repetition. Can I just ask you a question? You haven't really mentioned the format. So sometimes you will interview a Guardian reporter. Sometimes there'll be two reporters or a reporter and someone else. And sometimes, as you said, there's a human story. How do you choose who the protagonist is, whether it's the reporter, like if you're looking around now at South Africa or Haiti, is it always going to be a reporter, or will you sometimes, like I know you did the human rights story in Egypt, which was very powerful, and there was no reporter. It was a victim of human rights abuse.
It was, yes, and that was one we'd worked on. So that was an example of when we wanted to tell a story. So it was Karim's story, which had been in the
This is very good. Again, I would recommend people listen to this.
Yeah, so Karim and Nara, who ended up in prison, and it's a really awful story. And my colleague Courtney Youssef had followed this when it first broke quite a few months ago, got in touch with them, said, look, we want to do an interview. And it took quite a few months to set it up. But we decided, that was, if you have a story like that and you've got, his partner was a brilliant speaker and he was a very powerful speaker as well. And to be able to speak to them together, we just knew would be a great way of doing it. We didn't need a correspondent to narrate that story. And, you can use Anushka through her questions and script through the bits that you need to. But ordinarily, with something like Haiti, which we haven't done yet, we've got two correspondents we could use. And it will really be the one who is, often it's who's available and who has covered it the most. But obviously the thing that, and I think this is the case in so many organisations, is you don't want to take away from the local voice. And one of the advantages of the pandemic has been that because our correspondents haven't always been able to get to places, we've ended up using more local reporters on the ground. So last year when the protests in Belarus happened, Andrew Roth, our Moscow correspondent, wasn't able to get there, but he said, look, there's an amazing local journalist in Belarus you should use. So we actually did the whole episode with her. And you can never be too sure how that will go, because, you know, we can produce our journalists a lot more and they listen to the podcast and they get the tone of The Guardian. But she was absolutely fantastic and was out there every day in these protests. And so when the blogger was arrested on that flight a couple of months ago, we called her up and got her back on again, but we did it with Andrew that time because Andrew had also been out there reporting. And the key thing, as you suggested, Mark, is to make sure that your voices aren't doubling up. They've got to kind of serve a purpose. But wherever we can, if we're doing stories from other countries, we always try and get a voice from within that country. And covering Tigray is so difficult because...
So if people are pitching stories to you, it's both the story and the person, the voice. So it could be a human interest story. Here's someone who's been through something extraordinary and can talk about it, and it hasn't really been reported.
Yeah.
Or it could be, here's a story that we think you should be covering, and then you would think about the best way to cover it.
Yeah, and we're really open to everything. Like if it's a story we haven't heard of, I mean, it doesn't mean we won't do it. So, I mean, we did an episode a couple of weeks ago about the Indigenous children, the bodies of which have been found in these schools in Canada. And it wasn't a story that was hugely well reported here, but you know, when you just hear it, you think, gosh, that's awful. And we ended up managing to find a guy who had been to one of the schools, and the interview was like, I mean, I've never done such a difficult interview. So you never know when those things are going to come out. But I suppose, yeah, the ingredients for us are great audio. If you have tape, that's brilliant, and we will always be interested. I know some people have actually pitched me stories with tape before, and I'll always be really keen on that. And when I say tape, like that can be anything really. I mean, actually, I can give a quick example through, if it's helpful, through our through Tom Phillips in Brazil, who did an episode with us. This is Tom. He's brilliant. He's one of our star reporters. He did an episode with us a little while ago about the favelas in Rio, and he'd spent quite a lot of time being embedded in a favela. And I'm going to just play this clip, because I think in this you'll be able to hear the tape he got on his iPhone, just was recording as he walked around, basically. Let's see if this plays.
What did they show you as you walked around?
So we started on the east side of the community by the very polluted river that runs through it, and then ended up at the Samba school, which is at the northern entrance to Jacarezinho, under the railway line. And inside the sort of the warehouse-like building, there were perhaps a dozen local community leaders who just really looked stunned at trying to process what had happened.
Leandro, me conta pouco mais da sua experiência ontem, então. O que você viu?
One of the community leaders I met said that in nearly 40 years of life in Jacarezinho, he had never seen anything like it. And said it was a massacre and a witch hunt. With the help of those activists, we went walking through the alleyways. A lot of the walls were riddled with bullet holes, some from the previous day's operation, some from previous confrontations. And actually then I started comparing some of the pictures I'd been sent with the place where I was standing, and realised that actually I was standing exactly where one of the people had been killed the previous day. And then we moved around the corner and we're taking it to Flavio and Andre's house.
So all that audio you can hear in the background is just what he's recorded on his iPhone, and just him basically holding it out and leaving it on record on voice notes. And I just think it's very, very powerful and very simple as well, to just have someone who's very good at describing where they are, what's happening, with the sounds of that behind, hearing a bit of Tom speaking Portuguese, hearing the sort of sounds of people, the kind of stress of it. And so I think, we never mind how much tape we get sent, because we can sort of mine it for those moments, and it just kind of really brings a piece to life for us.
Actually. Are you happy if I circulate your email for people
Yeah.
to email you? Great.
Please do.
So we have a question from Chris from the One Campaign. This is about pitching. Chris?
Hello. Really, really interesting kind of presentation. So much to think about. And I feel almost a bit cheesy saying this because obviously, like every other organisation, you're kind of wondering, how do we get into podcasts? Is it too late? Is it,
No.
that's encouraging, although we'll see how many listeners we get. Although maybe that's not the point, but I suppose the thing for that I'm interested in is, how would you suggest we cover big stories? And by big, I mean, one doesn't have programs, so we don't necessarily have access to first person accounts in the same way. But we do tend to cover, I'd almost call them like meta issues, and can be hard to characterize into kind of individual narratives of such a person. Like the big one we are looking at is around vaccine access, and this, what is going on in, the next few months. I mean, according to our calculations, this was a week ago or something, but there's of the 3.7 billion doses of the COVID vaccine administered, I think something not many more than 50 million of them had been administered in Africa, which is bonkers. And at the same time as governments, including the UK and around the world, are considering booster shots, and the scientific efficacy of booster shots is already debated, let alone it's a bit weird that people are considering getting their third shot here when doctors and nurses in so many countries haven't even had their first shot. So quite big abstract things that can be hard for a podcast format, because obviously you want that kind of first person account, that character, that person to tell you their lived experience. So what would your advice be on kind of bridging the gap between this sort of big abstract huge issue and how it would work well in a podcast sort of format?
I suppose there's two things here, aren't there? So in terms of if someone was pitching to us for something you could offer, I'm assuming you have people you work with who know a huge amount about this. And so obviously speaking to a guest is one way that we would do it as part of a wider podcast, say, that was harnessed by our reporter who was talking about, I think an episode for us on, the vaccine in Africa would be brilliant, actually, or perhaps to take one particular country in Africa and look at how it's being administered there. That's the other thing, right? Is, okay, so it's a really big issue. How do you tell that really big issue through something smaller? But within audio, there's really clever ways that you can tell a story like that, which is actually a lot of numbers and also a lot of layers, is the way that you've told it there, starting from, say Boris Johnson or Matt Hancock talking about a booster shot and then broadening it out. So it's sort of thinking about your plot points, I think. And I think you could do a really fascinating episode, which is sort of the numbers perhaps of vaccines. And I would say a podcast, which is so well known, but is really clever at doing this, is the American podcast Radio Lab, who are brilliant at breaking down how to cover data. And I think that what audio can do, it sort of can make you feel like you're going on a journey through something. So within that story, there's obviously lots of different locations. So could you, through your scripting, make people feel like they're going to different places, and you're kind of spotlighting on different vaccine take-ups? So I think that although it's a really broad issue, you could either decide to do a few episodes which explored it through different countries, or you could do one which just looked at one place. And in terms of, as I say, for us, if you have someone that we can speak to who can give us the insight and really explain why it's happening and what's happening, then that's definitely something we would always consider, because our correspondents might not be able to do that in the same way, essentially. So I think I also
think one of the things that's interesting about podcasts, particularly yours, is that so much journalism, as Chris has implied, is story-led, story and character, and journalists almost have an aversion to issues.
Yeah.
Whereas you are not afraid to tackle an issue because you use your reporter as the guide to guide you through the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Can we just move on, because we've had a few questions on promotion and marketing. Tijen, do you want to ask your question?
Yep. Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Sorry, my camera's not working.
All right.
Just thank you first for accommodating this. I just wanted to ask, obviously there's been a lot, we've been talking about the content of the podcast. I just wanted to know a bit more about actually promoting and marketing your podcast, obviously other than the usual kind of putting it onto certain Amazon platforms or Spotify and things. Just what are the best kind of channels and mediums through which to really get it out there and get people to take notice and listen?
It's a really difficult, and obviously I wish our marketing team were here, but we are incredibly lucky because we have the brand identity with The Guardian. We're on the homepage every day. When we launched, we had a tube advert, we had billboards. Like, to get people to listen to podcasts on a big scale, like, I'm not gonna lie, it takes like a lot to push it out there. And still sometimes when we get marketing surveys, people come back and say that they think we're a BBC podcast. So, you know, it's quite difficult, but I think definitely in terms of like making it easier is obviously having like a good name and a logo honestly makes a difference. A big thing is trying to have conversations with Apple. Not just getting on a platform is important, but if you can develop relationships with the people at Apple app podcasts, you know, one of the things that really pushes listeners, I don't know if you're all familiar with the podcast app, but you know, they have banners where they sort of select their podcast for the week or give sort of a kind of promotion for a day to a podcast, and that genuinely makes a difference to who listens to it. But one of the best ways actually that you can promote without having to spend money, which is always helpful, is to go out and search for other podcasts who are like yours and see if the people on those podcasts are happy to talk about your podcast and vice versa. And that's the thing you notice a lot in podcasting, is podcasts will kind of organically share each other's content, or maybe we'll think about interviewing each other or that kind of thing. That's a really good way of getting out a bit more. If you have one podcast that has a few more listeners than you, that's really useful. And I think social media is good, but it is kind of getting to people at the source. So if there's a way of promoting yourself more on the different platforms, then that's really helpful. But this is also a conversation that you can have with. And
you obviously took a decision not to have social media accounts in the name of Today in Focus. Why was that?
I don't know why that was. I mean, I think now I'm quite glad, because it would just be more work. Yes. We did, but one thing we did try for a bit is our marketing team were making little audiograms, which were really a thing a few years ago, and, you know, little videos with our clips. But I mean, there's probably people here who are much more experienced in social media than me, tend to find that Instagram and Twitter are not big drivers to actually the audio itself.
Yeah.
And a lot of our listeners mostly come through the apps. We do get quite a bit through the website, but nothing versus podcast apps. So that's where people are finding stuff, I think. But one of my big complaints about the podcasting industry is it's very difficult to find stuff. There are so many podcasts.
Yeah.
So I think really know who your audience is, what kind of group of podcasts you're in, and maybe go and explore that to find ways to promote within that kind of sector, I suppose.
Yeah, so we're going to run for a few more minutes, but if anyone has to leave, obviously feel free to leave. I want to talk to Rachel about the logistics of putting together a podcast. Before I do that, can I just plug our next event? We have a lot of members who are involved in making and promoting podcasts, and we're going to have a workshop for producers and anyone involved or interested. I mean, Susanna's been very helpful giving tips, so she'll be there, but it's an opportunity to network and share experiences. 12 noon on Tuesday, the 3rd of August. So do please, if you're interested in carrying on this conversation, sign up for that event. So Rachel, putting a podcast together, how do you go about putting it together? What are the different steps?
I can show you, and you just said you're going to do a bit of production there, but I can show you what an edit or what an edit might look like.
Mm.
So we, there's the active interviewing, and at the moment we're all doing it remotely, obviously. So you need your interviewee and your interviewer to both be recording themselves. So I record myself on this Shure microphone, which is plugged into a Zoom H4n recorder, and I have quite a lot of kit actually to power this, because that's quite a powerful microphone. And that makes,
you're literally making these from your bedroom.
Yeah, I've done.
Amazing. Because the sound quality is so good.
Well, you have a very powerful microphone and you have the kit to support it.
Yeah,
you can basically get away with quite a lot.
Well, there's no traffic noise, or you haven't got a train at the end of your garden.
I actually live next to a hospital, a fire station, a police station and a train station, would you believe? So it is really noisy out this window and I have to stop quite a lot. What is on, so you've got 4 tracks? So this is just an example of people who do editing or are interested of an intro that I put together. Our intros are really important. It's obviously where you hook people in, explain the story, and also where you put your best audio sometimes. And this is one that we made for an episode that we put out a couple of weeks ago about the building safety scandal, or the cladding scandal. And an idea that I'd had for this that I wanted to implement was just to collect voices of lots of different people who are experiencing this, because it's so widespread, and to give a sense of just how endemic it is. So this looks quite complicated, but it's pretty simple, just voice notes on WhatsApp that we ask people to send us on the same theme, and then we put them all together. And this is without sound design. This is just in my voice edit. So I'll just play. You can see you've got my track up here in orange. This is the layered audio, and this is my track for the end question. So I'll just play it so you can hear it through, basically.
Across the country, thousands of people are caught up in a building safety crisis.
My name is Will.
My name's Paul Afshar.
I live in Hackney, in London. I am a leaseholder of a property in Sheffield. The problem with our building is that it has a timber frame. We have got ACM cladding.
All in all, last year cost me £12,000. So that included the waking watch,
missing cavity barriers and insulation, which never met regulations at the time of construction.
£1,000 in extra insurance costs.
No mortgage company, no bank would lend to a buyer with a building with cladding.
Essentially, we've been told that the building should never have been signed off.
What it effectively meant was that my flat was worth nothing.
And then we got a massive bill. It came up to nearly 80 to 90
where we wake up in the middle of the night just thinking about costs.
A life where I can't sell my flat, I can't
The best case scenario is
12 months of worry.
just get on with our lives as normal, like we thought we would, like everyone else does.
Living in a flat which could be dangerous.
I don't really see a way out at the moment. So, yeah.
So you can just hear in that, that kind of took quite a while actually, because you're sort of trying to get each clip to speak to each other and to sort of get each person to take you through the little grain in the story. And the kind of vision I'd had when I made this was for Axel, our sound designer, to kind of make it sound very sort of frantic, which in the end is what he managed to do. So we will edit that up. The producer will edit my track together with the guest track, or however many guests.
So how long do you have to edit? How long does it take to do that initial edit?
Can, if we need it quickly, a day. We might get an hour of audio. We need it to get down to under 30. And then you have to think about things like putting in archives, so little news clips and stuff. But we're very, very team focused. So we will have sort of on each episode, you'll have a presenter, a producer and an exec on each one. And between us, we will all listen to every episode that goes out has probably been listened to by sort of 5 people 3 or 4 times. So it's quite relentless. And each time we will do a little bit more cutting or add a bit more in. It can be a long process.
So the producer is also doing the edit?
Yeah, so the producer plans the interview with the presenter, preps the interviewee and sets up the recording, which I say is all remote. And then they take the audio, they do the first edit, and then we'll all get together send, I mean, sometimes we listen to episodes overnight, send edits in the morning, and we keep working basically until we hand it over, ideally in the morning, to the sound designer, so they've got all day to work on it if needs be. But as I mentioned earlier, you know, sometimes you just don't have that time, and in a day it's very like, get the cut. We might have 2 producers working on stuff if we need it, but generally, yeah, that's kind of how we do it. And for most episodes, you'll have a lead time of about 3 or 4 days to make from original idea through to getting it to the sound designer. But it really does depend. So you have to be quite flexible, basically.
But I mean, in other words, there's a lot of work happening behind the scenes that isn't apparent to the listener, especially as the tone is quite informal.
Yeah.
And how much of it is scripted in advance? Do you have like a shooting script before you go into it?
So we'll make a list of questions, which I'll generally try and stick to. And then, you know, so those questions are scripted, but a lot of the questions that you hear are kind of organic, just Anushka or I just responding. And then obviously the intro is all scripted, you know, those little bits of furniture. But yeah, we tend to not try and script too much. And obviously, if it is scripted, you want it to not sound too scripted. So it's trying to be conversational, and that comes, writing for audio is very different from writing for print. And it is just kind of keeping things simplified and working out how to get people to understand things. So like when we're doing episodes about, oh God, I've done all these episodes recently about things like Bitcoin, which I still don't understand. Trying to get people, trying to come up with metaphors and ways of explaining stuff.
And what about the intro? How important is that? Because sometimes you listen to an intro and it sort of tells you so much that you don't bother listening to the rest of it.
Yeah, I think maybe we are in danger of doing that sometimes, actually. I think intro is really important. We often, sometimes you'll pick, like, sort of peg a whole episode on an intro, because your story will come to you and you'll be like, God, I can just hear the intro to this piece. Like, it's going to be that voice, or it's going to be that place, and we know this person is going to like take us to this little point. Like the dream story is when you can focus on one scene, and that like opens you up to this whole episode. And so in something like this Grenfell one, because it's quite a formulaic piece in a sense, it's an interview with a reporter about a history of a policy failure, and it's also an interview with someone who's experiencing that firsthand. So we could have used her at the top because she was very emotive, but I'd always known that I wanted it to be like to make people feel something if we could, because I think a lot of people are aware of the cladding story, but if you're not experiencing it, it's maybe difficult to know just how stressful it is. And I kind of wanted to give people a sense. I mean, I can play it now just quick. I know we need to go soon.
Can I just say, let me know if anyone has any questions. We'll be finishing in a couple of minutes.
Yeah. So I'll just play what Axel did with this. We've just heard it to give you a sense of, we wanted to create how kind of frantic it is.
Okay.
Yeah. Let's get this to play.
Across the country, thousands of people are caught up in a building safety crisis.
My name is Will.
My name's Paul.
I live in Hackney in London. I am a leaseholder of a property in Sheffield. The problem with our building is that it has a timber frame. We have got ACM cladding.
All in all, last year cost me £12,000, so that included the waking watch,
Missing cavity barriers and insulation, which never met regulations at the time of construction.
£1,000 in extra insurance costs.
No mortgage company, no bank would lend to a buyer with a building with cladding.
Essentially, we've been told that the building should never have been signed off.
What it effectively meant was that my flat was worth nothing.
And then we got a massive bill. It came up to nearly 80 to 90 grand.
There's nights where we wake up in the middle of the night just thinking about costs.
A life where I can't sell my flat, I can't remortgage my flat.
The best case scenario is
12 months of worry.
just get on with our lives as normal, like we thought we would, like everyone else does. You know,
Living in a flat which could be dangerous.
I don't really see a way out at the moment. So
After the Grenfell fire trap.
So you can sort of hear there that Axel did, yes, some great sound design underneath it. And I think that the best thing with an intro is if you create something which sounds quite dramatic, if you've got an episode where perhaps it is just one voice, you know, you can really make people feel like it's quite robust, and you can kind of buy people in at the beginning and get their attention and invest them. So it is really important to get the beginning of your podcasts. Like, I think it is key. And I think the easiest thing is go with your strongest audio and kind of work from there. Go with the thing that made you want to make this podcast in the first place and made you interested in it. And the thing about the cladding story is what's insane about it is it's just affecting millions of people. And so I wanted to create that feeling in the beginning. And so I spoke to Axel before and we talked about how we could do it. And we've worked together for a while now, so we're kind of in tune, I think. And he loves it when you go to him and say, I want you to make me feel like this with your sound design. So yeah, I hope that's helpful.
That's amazing. Thank you very much. I mean, just to wrap up, let's just sort of try and sum up, because you've been doing this for a few years and you've learned a lot. What would you say are your top tips, or the things that are uppermost in your mind?
Let me think. I think that let me think. It's such a difficult question because I've learned so much while doing this. I think I would always say, this is too early, Mark, that you should always keep things simple.
Yeah.
You know, whenever you come to a story, just take your time and pull it apart and work out what the really interesting thing is and why you're doing it. Never think that there's a certain way of doing things, and never think there isn't a story for you, or that there isn't a way of making it work in audio. Audio is so clever because you can do so much more with it than any other medium. You can make stuff sound like what it isn't. You can just have conversations around the table, or you can go out and collect some sound and have someone scripting over it. There's so many different formats. And so it's working out, how do you get the best out of a person, or how do you get the best out of a story? And I think the really key thing that we've learned is, like, teamwork is very, very important to us. And I didn't say this earlier, but we have a big team. You know, we have like 10 people plus freelancers working on Today in Focus to be able to put it out. It's not a small operation, and we could even do with more people. So I think having a group of people who are all kind of on the same page with stuff is really important. And just make things that you're interested in. Like, if you're listening back and you kind of switch off a bit, ask yourself why that is. And, you know, that's really hard, but I think, yeah, making stuff that you're interested in, but also always keeping an open mind. Like, I get sent emails all the time pitching me stuff, and I read every one, because I don't think you can ever assume that you're covering everything, and you could always like miss an opportunity. So I think being curious and keeping an open mind about things is really important.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Rachel. I feel we should have you back in a year or two when the podcast landscape has changed. Today in Focus is unrecognizable.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think we will change, and I think that's important. And although listeners take a while to get used to change, so it can be tricky.
Yeah, they sort of don't want change, but then once they get used to it, maybe they appreciate it.
Yeah,
you have to be sort of slightly ahead of your audience.
Yeah, well, yeah, we just want people to trust us, basically, and I think we've got that, and so we can kind of do new things, which is really exciting. But you know, the core of it will never change. It's Guardian journalism in audio.
Yeah, and will you be presenting more now?
I actually don't know. We're in, I mean, I'm probably, it actually also depends when I'm taking my holiday. But yeah, I think we're going to sort of work out how it goes. And this is quite an exciting time because we're sort of figuring it out. We always figure it out a bit as we go along. It's got to be trial and error, I think, in audio. And when you've got 5 episodes a week to make, you don't get a lot of time for experimentation on the side. So it's sort of all hands to the deck and just putting stuff out and seeing how it goes, really. And I think sometimes we're all quite surprised and we've always been surprised with how well it's received. Don't think any of us ever expected that. So yeah, I think it's gone quite well so far. So we'll try doing a little bit more of the same while also pushing it out and trying different things as well.
Okay, well, good luck, and don't leave too soon.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for all your questions and for listening. And
yeah, thank you, everyone.
If you have any more questions or stories or ideas that you think we should be looking at, please do email. Please do send my email around, and it'd be great to hear from you.